Hello, everyone. Lovely to see you all here. Anyone would think it was a really hot topic or something of the day. I'm sure that if you've been in London during the last week or so, you will have heard, caught up with, read bite-sized chunks of Professor Stiglitz, the sort of the Stiglitz Twiglets, if you like. But tonight you get the full 3 courses. We've got an hour or so in which we can explore a whole range of thoughts. The single currency experiment has been a disaster. That's what Joseph Stiglitz writes in his latest book, The Euro and its Threat to the Future of Europe. Europe is in crisis. Large parts of it he describes as having endured a lost decade. And crucially, any growth that there is has not been widely shared. So tonight, some of these questions are going to be at the forefront. Why did Europe adopt a single currency without the institutions to make it work? And over the course of the next hour, I hope we can really start to explore some of these theories and ask if Europe, in its current state, is as doomed as that sounds. We can also bring in a bit of discussion on Brexit. Perhaps by 8 o'clock tonight, we might know what Brexit means. But I'll leave that to the professor. In terms of the arrangement of tonight, we're going to hear from Professor Stiglitz, first of all, setting out some of his theories. We'll interview, and then more than happy to take questions, your questions from the floor. There will be roving mics, so please don't hold back. Catch my eye, and we'll come and take as many of your thoughts as we have time for before 8. But without more ado, a warm welcome to Professor Stiglitz.
Well, she's given away the plot line that the euro is not working, in case anybody didn't know that. Maybe I should begin by saying, why should an American be writing a book about the euro? Doesn't America have enough problems of its own? Trump, as an example. And the answer is yes, we do have enough problems. One of the answers is, of course, that the euro, for an economist, is a really interesting experiment. If I were a European, I wouldn't want this experiment done on me, but it was an experiment, and economists love experiments. We love the data that experiments give, and it's very hard to get experiments of this magnitude, and you learn a lot from experiments like this one. As I say, unfortunately, it's an experiment that has not worked out as well as the visionaries that had conceived of the euro. And maybe it's important to realize that the people who conceived of the euro were visionaries. They thought that this was the next step in the European project, the project of integrating the European countries closer together. It was, in that sense, a political idea. It was a political project. But the politics wasn't strong enough to do what was required to make a single currency work within the large diversity that was within Europe. There's a lot of diversity within the states of the United States. We have a single currency, and it works. So the natural question is, why do I say the dollar is working in the United States, and why can't the euro work in Europe? Well, it can work, and I'll come back to that later, but not as it was originally conceived. It was, in that sense, flawed at birth. To make a single currency work among a large group of diverse countries requires a whole set of institutions. The reason is very simple. When you have a single currency, you take away 2 of the important adjustment mechanisms. You take away the interest rate and the and the exchange rate, which adjust when a country is hit by a shock like the 2008 financial crisis. But they took away these adjustment mechanisms and they didn't put anything in its place. It was worse than that. Not only didn't they put anything in its place, they tied the hands of the European countries. They tied them by insisting, if you can't adjust through exchange rate, interest rate, economists would say, well, there's fiscal policy, tax and expenditure policy. But they said, no, you can't use that. You can't have more than a 3% deficit. And then finally, on monetary policy, they told their central bank, the European Central Bank, that just focus on inflation. In contrast to the United States, where our central bank worries about employment, growth, financial stability, and inflation. So they constructed a set of rules that I think was doomed to failure. This represents one of the major differences between my book and some of the other books looking at trying to interpret what has happened. There are many people who say that the problem with the euro is the policymakers. They made bad policy mistakes. And particularly on the left, there's a view that they demanded austerity. Austerity has essentially never worked. Absolutely right that the policy making could not have been worse. But even if you had the most brilliant policy makers as the economic czar, they could not have made it work without changing the rules and the structure. So there's a lot of discussion about structural reform. No country has perfect structure. The United States needs a structural reform. I could talk about structural reform in our healthcare, telecom, lots of sectors of the economy. But the real structural reform that's needed in Europe is not the structural reforms in the individual countries, it's the structure of the Eurozone itself. And I'll try to, if I have time, talk about it, or we'll talk about it in the discussion period. The reason that the structure of the Eurozone was so flawed was that it was informed by certain ideas, ideologies, interests, ideas that were prevalent at the time it was constructed. I sometimes think if it had started not in 1992, which is when the Maastricht Convention was signed, but 10 years later, or even 8 years later, the views would have been very different. At that time, the prevalent view was that if only government got things right, low deficits and debt, central banks make sure there was not inflation, everything would be fine. The market economy would do its wonders. And that was affected a little bit by the crises that were experienced before in the 1980s, the Latin American crisis. But by the late 90s, we had a totally different view. I was chief economist of the World Bank at the time of the East Asia crisis, and the East Asian countries had surpluses, they had low inflation, they had none of these problems. It was the private sector that was the source of the problem. And so even if governments had kept low deficits and debts and low inflation, it doesn't ensure that the economy is going to work well. In fact, even within in the Eurozone, the unfortunate thing was that the beginning of the crisis began with Greece. And there was fiscal profligacy there. But Spain and Ireland had a budget surplus. The debt-GDP ratio was very low. And yet, they had a crisis. The crisis caused their deficits and their debt. It wasn't the other way around. And then the policy of austerity made things even worse. The policy of austerity brought the economy down, tax revenue went down, and the result of that has been that the economies have not recovered. Interestingly, these ideas that by now the idea of austerity should have been totally discredited, and the experience of Ireland and Spain should have taught reinforced this lesson. Germany, unfortunately, came to the wrong result. It said we have to double down on austerity. We have to affirm our commitment to low deficits and debts. So they just they doubled down on a bad idea. And they didn't learn the basic lesson that they should have come away from what had happened in the Euro crisis. And so what they did is blame the victim. When it wasn't profligacy in Spain and Ireland, as I say, it was the structure of the Eurozone itself. What they created then in the Euro and the Eurozone was a dynamic that led to divergence of these countries. It led the rich countries getting richer and the poor getting poorer. Germany was the beneficiary, kept getting better off. The other countries got worse. It created greater divergences in the politics. The idea was that the prosperity, the success of the euro would reinforce European solidarity, and then the European project would proceed, and there'd be closer economic integration and political integration. But the failure of the euro, the failure of European economies, the Eurozone economies in particular, has predictably had just the opposite effect, because they didn't put in place the institutions that would have allowed the euro to work. The divergences, political, economic, have increased, and the antipathies have increased, and it's very clear now that the ambition of having more solidarity has been gone just the other way. So let me try to explain why, rather than creating, they realized they needed to create a converging system, but they created a diverging system. So behind their idea was a simplistic economics, the kind of things that you would learn in a first economics course. But if you had a good teacher, they would explain why you shouldn't believe the economics you were about to learn, that it was too simplistic. So their basic idea was, if you took away all the barriers to the flow of capital, labor, goods, you would get more efficient allocation of resources. Capital would flow from where it was abundant to where it was scarce, and that would increase productivity, and that would raise standards of living everywhere. So that was the basic idea, and it has a certain degree of plausibility. But anybody who had looked at the global economy over the last few decades would have realized that simple theory isn't true. Money has been flowing from developing countries, which are poor in capital, to the rich countries, to the United States, in a seeming anti-gravity flow. It's been moving uphill. And we understand now why that is. And let me try to explain it in the context of, in another example. After the 2008 crisis, which originated in the United States, where did money go? In 2009, money left all over the world and went to the United States. Was it because the American economy had proven itself the most able to manage risk? Its banks had shown that they were really superb banks at other than exploiting poor people? No, the answer was very simple. They were backed by the US government, which had the deepest pocket. I was on a conference call right after Lehman Brothers collapse, where the Democratic, Obama was already the Democratic nominee, and the Democrats were trying to figure out how should we respond to Bush's initiatives about responding to the Lehman Brothers. And Paulson had put on a table the idea of $700 billion being given to the banks. And the question was, should the Democrats support that, oppose it, criticize it? What should they say? Now, most of the people on the conference call were bankers, because those are the economic experts. Those are, of course, the same people who have brought the economy to the brink of ruin. And the conversation began, why only $700 billion? And the answer came back, well, $1 trillion sounded too big. And then the next comment is, but don't worry, if you need more, there's more there. You know, just don't worry about it. Well, what is the point of the story? The point is that backing any country's banking system is the government. The depth of the pocket and the commitment of the government to bail its banks out. And you know, most of you know that U.S. Treasury is a wholly owned subsidiary of Wall Street. So and that was why money flowed naturally from all over the world to the United States in the aftermath of the 2008 crisis. Now let's switch back to Europe. Spain has a problem. Spanish banks are in trouble, partly because of bad lending, partly whenever the economy gets very weak, a lot of firms can't pay back what they owe. A lot of homeowners can't pay back what they owe. So you have your money in a Spanish bank, and you're asking yourself, am I going to count on the Spanish government to bail me out, to give me money if there's a problem, or should I take my money and put my money in a German bank? Well, the answer is pretty obvious, and if you don't know how to answer that question, you probably aren't among the 1%. The point is that the single market made it very easy to move money from Spain to Germany. So what happens as money starts going from Spain to Germany? The Spanish banks have less money, they can do less lending, they start contracting, and as that happens, the Spanish economy gets weaker. That means the less tax revenue, and that means less ability of the Spanish government to bail out a bank and the depositors if there's a problem. So it's a downward vicious circle. That's the kind of divergence that the Europeans created in the Eurozone. So money went from the poor countries to the rich. This is a kind of private austerity which was much more powerful than the public austerity, which was powerful enough as it was. And so this is just one of several examples of how the Euro, that I describe in the book, is how the Eurozone led the poor countries to get poorer, the rich countries to get richer. And within the countries, the austerity policies led the poor in those countries to really have a very hard time, and inequality in these countries to grow, suicides to increase. You know, as I say, it's been a disaster economically. So the question is, where does one go from here? It is, as I say, the fundamental problem is the design of the Eurozone. It's very clear to me that there are only two directions to go. Either there needs to be more Euro or less Euro, or more Europe or less Europe. That is to say, either the project that was started some 20 years ago has to be finished and put in place the kinds of institutions that would make it work. Not the same as the United States. It doesn't have to be anywhere near the degree of federalism that one has in the United States. It can fall far short of that. But you need some things like deposit insurance, some form of Eurobond, some banking union. There are a whole number of reforms. Economically, they're not big. But what I'm afraid of is, politically, they're bigger than Europe is willing to go. Particularly when Germany says Europe is not a transfer union. And when they mean by transfer union, they don't want to have the kind of mutuality, the kind of insurance, like a common deposit insurance. So if it is not possible to have more Europe to finish the project, then I'm afraid that there has to be less. My own view is that the current policy of muddling through will not work. The current policy of muddling through is basically careening from one crisis to the next. A year ago, there was the Greek crisis. Now, they patched that up. If you listen to the leaders after they patched it up, you would have said they solved the problem. If they solved the problem, would Greece be better today than it was a year ago or worse? Well, obviously, it would be better. In fact, Greece is worse today than it was a year ago. The Greek crisis is not gone. It's just gone from the newspapers. And it will be back. Right now, a lot of people in financial markets are talking about an Italian crisis. There's an Italian bank that may go under. The state aid provisions may limit the ability of Italy to come to the rescue. There are some peculiar special nature of Italy where the bondholders are ordinary individuals who thought they were buying things like CDs, certificates of deposit, but in fact became bondholders. The political ramifications of letting it go down are very significant. Renzi understands this, has tried to put a patchwork, but it doesn't look like it's enough money. So right now there's a lot of discussion of Italy as the next crisis. But you should be clear, if it's not Italy, it'll be another, it might be another Brexit in some other country. The point is that the failure of Europe to bring prosperity, of the euro to bring prosperity, the fact that most of the countries have per capita income lower than they were at the time of the crisis, 2007-8, it's a lost decade basically, and it may be for some of the countries a lost quarter century, means that the politics of this may turn very ugly, and that perhaps is the most alarming concern, the dangers of the political move to the right. So muddling through is not possible. More Europe is the right answer, but seems likely off the cards. And the other alternatives are an amicable divorce or some other arrangement which allows the various countries to break off into 2-3 different groups. Doesn't mean you have to go back to where you were before the single currency, before 1999, but the current arrangements are clearly not viable. There are many ways in which this third alternative can be organized, and I described several of them. Among economists, there's a broad consensus the easiest way for a breakup would be for Germany to leave. And there are some good economic arguments to explain why it's easier for Germany to leave than for the countries of the South to leave. The debt would have to be restructured. But the point is, it's not that this transition out of the euro is going to be costless. It's not going to be easy. But remember, the current path has a very high cost to it. The current path is associated with stagnation, with depression. The depressions in Spain, Greece, Ireland, Portugal are greater than the Great Depression. And what is being sacrificed today is not only their GDP today, but their future economic growth. So the choices going forward, there are no easy choices. You know, unscrambling an egg, an omelet is not easy. And so none of the choices are, if you asked, would you have started, knowing what you knew now, would you have undertaken the Euro project? The answer is clearly, I think, no. But Europe is where it is, and then the question is, where do they go from here? And it's my view that given the current politics, better than the current path of muddling through is a beginning of an open debate about the best way of moving to the next stage in the evolution of Europe. Thank you.
Thanks, Professor Stiglitz. Let's pick up controversially at the end with that idea of amicable divorce, which we all know is an oxymoron. So if you are a doctor, a medical doctor, and the euro walks into your surgery and says, I'm not feeling too great, what are my life chances? Honestly, how long do you give me?
That's a good question, and most patients don't understand probability theory, so I would say it's very stochastic. It could be 6 months. You come in with cancer, it could be 6 months. You could be one of those miracle cases that might last 6 years. So there's a range.
So 6 years is your top?
No. I was saying that facetiously. Look, they could muddle through for a long period of time at an enormous cost of this stagnation and this careening from crisis to crisis, which, the result of this has been that the disparity between the rich and the poor has been getting greater, and the austerity in so many of the countries has been so costly. But what I try to give is a feeling that it's not really under the control of the Eurozone leaders. Maybe that's really what I want. It's not under the doctor's control, no matter why do I say that? It has a lot to do with democratic politics. There are large numbers of people who are rightfully very unhappy, and they think their politicians have not served them well. And so you see the growth of anti-Euro parties and the view that the centrist party, both center-left and center-right, have been behind the Euro, and they're moving to the extremes. Whether Le Pen is going to win or whether it's going to be in Italy, at some point, the coalition of the anti-Euro parties may get large enough that they may decide to leave. But the problem will arise even before that, because just think about it, the structure of the single market allows free mobility of capital. You're a hedge fund, and you see that the probability of one of these parties or one of these coalitions is getting up there. What do you start to do? You start pulling out your money. And then they start reading in the newspaper, in the Financial Times, that money is being pulled out. And what do? We say, I don't know what's going on, but I'm scared. And that then creates a momentum that may be uncontrollable.
Let me flip that on its head for a second. It's very easy right now to point to Europe and the pull, the attraction of the far right or the far left. Podemos we could talk about in Spain, or Syriza, of course, in Greece. But what if you said, actually, the main achievement of the EU and of the euro in terms of what it has done is that democratic burden that it's put on all the countries within it. We haven't seen a military coup in Europe. We haven't seen, Greece taken over by an army. We haven't seen as much instability in Italy in the last 15 years. Politically, maybe
15 years is a very short time.
But it happened quite often, particularly in Italy.
Not that often. The last was Mussolini, was in the 1930s. So even before that, actually. So I think the point is that we're seeing the growth of right-wing parties. I think it's a very big risk, is what I'm saying. That if I were looking in and say, what are you getting out of it? You're not getting economic growth. The analytics are pretty clear. You're not likely to get economic growth. it's all for a piece of paper, for a currency. Currencies just aren't worth it. If they work well, you may get a little bit better economic performance, but when they work disastrously, you get a disastrous economic performance. It just doesn't seem worth it. I don't see any benefit.
So I'll quote from you now. You say the design of the single currency project was so influenced by ideology and interest that it failed not only in its economic ambition, but also in its ambition of bringing countries closer together politically. Ideology is a very emotive, very powerful word. What do you think then was the ideology of the leaders at the time who brought it in?
Yeah, I tried to describe it. It was this view that if you only took away barriers to the mobility of labor capital, and you made it easier for labor to move, and capital, finance, to move more easily, you would get faster economic growth. So it was this, you might say, this view that markets are stable and efficient. And that's a very strong view, and it was widely held. After 2008, I think the view that markets on their own, unregulated, lead to economic efficiency or stability is not widely held. And that's why I say it was at that particular moment. Right. If they were doing that today, somebody would say, or a lot of people would say, wait, we have a lot of evidence that theory of just let capital move more easily across borders has some problems.
So just let me come in there. What do you think would not have been implemented if it had been 10 years later then? You don't think we would have had free movement? Or
I don't think you would have had the euro as a single currency. I think they would have said, we are not, we would have looked more carefully. What do you need to do to make a single currency work? And I think they would have realized that here are the institutions that you need. Let me go back just one more example. The Bretton Woods system was a system of fixed exchange rates that was established in 1944 at the end of World War II. When it was established, it was very clear they did not believe in the free flow of capital. It was based on fixed exchange rates, but not the free flow of capital. And it was very clear, Keynes said, free flow capital is not going to work. And then you had the growth of markets and the view about how markets work. And the critical point was when the Bretton Woods system broke down in the early 70s, people like Milton Friedman said, don't worry, capital flows are going to be stabilizing. Just let exchange rate fluctuate and capital flows will stabilize. Well, it turned out that was wrong. Free flows of capital have been very destabilizing. And to show you how that evolution of ideas has changed, after the 2008 crisis, the IMF, who have been the strongest advocates of the free flow of capital, for those of you who don't know, the IMF is not a left-wing organization. The IMF said capital controls are an important instrument, particularly at certain times when there's a shock to the system. So our thinking, our understandings have changed dramatically, and their views were very strongly influenced by the predominant views in 1992.
But would you also concede that at that time, Europe felt like a declining global power place, that actually, there was something must be done when you saw the emergence of China, you saw what was happening in the Far East, and there was a sense that Europe knew it was kind of, double or die?
No, I don't think so. I mean, at that particular moment, just think about it. It was 1989 was the Iron Curtain fell down. And that was the moment where West, the view of market economies was really dominant. And it was that view. And the United States, we had the same kind of belief in deregulation, the belief that markets worked. I was in the Clinton cabinet, and I saw that. I happened to argue against them. I won while I was there, but after I left, they went ahead and did it anyway. But the fact of it is that these views were on both sides of the Atlantic, both parties, both sides of the aisle, as we would say. Clinton pushed it, Tony Blair pushed these ideas, and so did the Republicans.
So when you look at your, I don't want to call it a formula, but your suggestions for what has to happen next, your sense is more Europe or less Europe. You don't think there is going to be more political integration within the Eurozone, do you?
Not at this juncture. It is possible, but I think it's unlikely. And one of the reasons that it's unlikely is really related to some of the themes that I talk about in the Euro book. And at the end, there's a chapter on the Brexit where I try to draw some of the parallels. The people who promised that globalization, deregulation, all these changes in the economic rules would bring prosperity, they said it was going to bring prosperity to everybody. They didn't say, oh, by the way, in the United States where I know the data better, they didn't say to the, by the way, when they started making all the reform, 90% of you are going to see your income stagnate. And the bottom 40% or 50% are going to see your incomes fall. That wasn't the deal that was offered. It was, the deal that was offered is, here we have a really great set of ideas, and maybe not everybody, but the vast majority are going to see greater prosperity. And we now have the data, and 90% of them have seen their income stagnate. And that is what is, I think fed the Brexit, feeding the Trump movement in the United States.
Do you think that Germany, bluntly, was a bully?
Was
a bully?
Yes. I think, a bully, it believed its ideas, and it inflicted some of these ideas on itself. So it really believed that austerity was going to work. But, you see the forecast coming out of the Troika. They have a formula. They say, follow these structural reforms, follow these austerity policies, and your economy is going to go down, but it's going to have a quick recovery. A year later, the economy has gone way down, and they said, well, our forecast wasn't quite right, but next year, if you follow our advice, things are going to turn around. We're just at the turnaround. You do it the next year, and year after year. If my students had come in with those repeated bad forecasts, they would be flunked. It's inexcusable. The first time might have been excusable, but by the time they've done it, every 6 months for year after year, you have to say their models were wrong. And that's why I use the word ideology. When the evidence comes in and your model's not working, you should revise your model.
Except Greece is constantly the victim in these pages. There are some critics, as you know, who call this a rant against neoliberal capitalism. That, it's not that you didn't like, it's not that there were no politics, but they weren't your politics in the construction of the Europe. Shouldn't every country have been prepared to play its own part? Or do you think there was absolute economic reason to say, yeah, you're off the hook, you might have to be off the hook?
No, I never said that Greece was off the hook. What I said, Greece is, of the crisis countries, as I pointed out, Spain and Ireland actually had a surplus. So you can't blame fiscal profligacy for them. And yet the same broad medicine was applied to all these countries. And that's why I say the German diagnosis and prescription was off. And they keep talking about Greece. They don't want to talk about Spain. They don't want to talk about Ireland because they know their diagnosis is wrong. in all these other cases. Greece is the only one. If Greece were the only problem, a country of 10 million, there wouldn't be any euro crisis. No, yeah, this would be, we would talk about the euro crisis, the Greek crisis, not the euro crisis. Let me put it another way. You know, if one country has a problem, you might say, it's that country's problem. They're bad actors. When you see so many countries, even Finland, you know, Northern Europe, virtuous. Per capita income today is lower than it was in 2007-8. And a simple reason, they've not been able to adequately adjust to the series of shocks which they've confronted. So Greece is the one country where, you know, clearly they deserve a lot of blame. You know, other people were complicitous. Goldman Sachs for hiding the numbers and the derivatives. There are lots of people that were to blame. But regardless of that, you have to begin with where you are. And the question at that point was that prescription the right prescription for Greece and for Greece's recovery, as opposed to punishment? So let me give one example that to me typifies what went, so wrong. The house is burning down. Greece is in a depression, and that's the only word. It's a depression, and the Troika is discussing how many days should milk be, how old can milk be, and still be called fresh milk. And Greece says 4 days, and the Troika says 10-day-old milk still should be called fresh milk. Now you have to ask, your mind at this point is befuddled. Why are they arguing about how many days milk should be fresh? And one answer is that the big dairy farm, the big dairy, milk producers in Netherlands want to be able to ship milk down to Greece and sell it as, quote, fresh. And they can't do it if it's 4 days, but they can do it if it's 10 days. Now, what will that do to the Greek economy? That will actually weaken the Greek economy. It will worsen their current account deficit. It will mean that their imports will go up. And that means the income of Greek farmers will go down, and the Greek income will go down. That was a policy designed to weaken Greece at the expense of Northern Europe. That's the example of what I say was badly constructed policy.
And you say flawed at birth. A lot of people were watching that pregnancy, long as it was. Why do you think that they didn't then have the right institutions or mechanisms in place to meet it?
Oh, I think they realized that they didn't have the right institutions. It was a theory of reform. The politics wasn't strong enough to create those institutions. It was a political agenda that said, let's have the euro, but the politics required doing things like common deposit insurance, maybe euro bonds, a whole set of political reforms that at that moment were not, the political unity wasn't strong enough. So they had a theory of reform. They thought that you start this ball rolling and the reforms would occur. People would see the euro is working. There would be enthusiasm in the euro. They would say, oh, this is great. Let's finish the project. Let's do these other things. And there would be a virtuous circle. And that might have happened. Life is very uncertain. Maybe it could have happened, although very little of that happened between 1992 and 2008. But certainly once 2008 happened, you didn't have any time at that point to do the reforms. They were at that point playing brinkmanship. And that actually, at that point in 2010, which is when, the financial crisis hit in 2008, but the euro crisis really set off with the Greek crisis in 2010, you see that lack of unity once again, because it was very clear in 2010 that Greece needed a debt restructuring. The IMF recognized that. Anybody looking at it, I looked at it, it was clear it needed a debt restructuring. Germany and France did not want a debt restructuring. Why? Because a debt restructuring would mean their banks, which had lent a lot of money to Greece, would be on the hook. And again, it's a pattern I've seen all over the developing countries, emerging markets. So what do? You have a bailout that you call the Greek bailout, but it's not a Greek bailout, it's a bailout of the German and French banks. 90% of the money that is so-called went to Greece really went to the German and French banks. Greece got a minuscule amount. And so what happened after that? Well, that didn't solve the problem. It kicked the can down the road, and then in 2012, you needed a deep restructuring. The European Central Bank opposed a deep restructuring, so again, the political resolve wasn't there. And now we're in 2016, and the IMF says Greece needs another deep restructuring because you didn't do it when you should have done in 2010. You didn't do it deep enough in 2012. And what is Germany saying? We're not having a debt restructuring. And so you again see the lack of solidarity, the lack of political will to do what, as I say, any independent expert would say you need to do in this particular case.
I'm going to stop hogging you now and open the floor to questions. I've left you all of Brexit, all of the US. We've got roving mics, and there's lots of hands up. I'm going to try and take 3 at a time. This lady here and 2 more hands here. If you can just come down to this bit. There's a lady here with her hand up. One hand, the lady on the end, and the gentleman in pink. You're number 3, sir. Thanks.
Wonder if you could comment how you see your election going this November and what the economic ramifications might be with either of those results.
You're as in US.
Yeah,
Yes.
that's right. I think, yeah. I feel very confident that Hillary is going to win. The other scenario is such a disaster that I don't want to even think about it. It's a nightmare. But I do think, all the polling, not that I have any inside information, all the polling, all the, deep analysis of the way our electoral college makes it very clear that she's going to win.
Would you be prepared to work for her in her cabinet?
Yes, but I think I actually like my academic role better. I think a professor is the best job in the world. You don't have to work too hard. You get to debate ideas, and there's no accountability. I mean, it's really.
And do you think that her politics, her economics, have been pulled to the left by this season, by Bernie Sanders?
Oh, very much so. But even before that, it's so interesting within the Democratic Party. There was no candidate running in the Democratic Party that was on the right side of the Democratic Party. It was all different shades of progressiveness. And she was running as a progressive. Bernie was more progressive, but it was very clear that it's a progressive. Now, where Bernie campaign made a big difference, I think, is the fact that the extent of the enthusiasm of young people for Bernie, I think, was a shock. it was a positive shock in the sense that there was so much faith still left in politics. You could say, you know, given what people were through, that was a surprise. But that enthusiasm has to make you think about what is it that they are caring about that we need to embed in our policies.
Our question is, what do you think the impact of the Brexit will be on the European single market economy, and how do you think that will impact negotiations around the Brexit Article 50?
Yeah, I don't think the departure of the UK is going to have much effect on the way Europe works as an economy. I think it may have some important effects on the politics in several different ways. One of them is the magnitude of the dissatisfaction should have been a wake-up call. And hopefully political leaders are sensitive to the way electorates feel. And if that is the case, they will pay more attention to some of the adverse consequences of the way they've structured the EU, the lack of concern about some of the people who've been left behind, the excessive rigidity in the application of some of the rules and regulations. Talking about, just to go back to the euro in my book a little bit, one of the things that I found quite astounding was Spain and Portugal were just getting back on the feet, and the European Commission ruled that their budget deficits were too large and they had to have another dose of austerity, which would push them back down. Now, fortunately, at the last minute, they got a reprieve. But the mindset that said, you know, you're naughty, you're going to be punished. We don't care if the unemployment is 20% in Spain, the youth unemployment close to 50%. You have to take your medicine of another dose of austerity. I hope that the Brexit vote is a message that that kind of politics is going to be counterproductive.
Sir.
I'm sorry to do this, Professor Stiglitz. I have two questions. I'm going to ask them both and let you answer the one which you think is more interesting. The first is, if a banking crisis starts to appear in the German sector where there has been some disquiet, do you think the way in which the European Union deals with it will be different from what it's done elsewhere, and as a result the output will be different? Or my second question would be, do you think there's anything to take out of the Icelandic experience of the last 8 years that would impact or inform one of your recommendations or your consideration about the EU?
Yeah, let me take the second one because I think it's really has a lot of important lessons. Iceland it's a very small country, so you have to be careful about extrapolating from it. But it had one of the deepest economic downturns. Its financial sector had some of the worst abuses. But they had a flexible exchange rate. And they did one other thing. They redenominated a lot of the debt that they had internally. And so they gave a lot of people a fresh start. And it's a way of dealing with excessive debt. And those two policies together resulted in Iceland having a very strong and very quick recovery.
Sir, I'm sorry, you were spoken over. The gentleman in the pink is next, then you, sir, and then I'm going to go right to the back. Yeah, you, sir. Did we get that?
Quick questions.
Yeah.
The first one is, would the euro have survived if it was just Germany and France? And the second question would be, what's the smallest step you think the eurozone could take towards its survival?
So would the euro survive if it was just Germany and France?
I don't think so, actually. I think the differences between Germany and France are actually too large. And the political cohesion is too small. You know, it's a combination of the similarity of the countries and the willingness to create the institutions that manage those differences. And so far, I haven't seen enough of that cohesion and enough, given the size of the differences. The second question, or
The smallest step for Europe to survive.
I think there will have to be several things. There's no magic bullet. But among the small steps that I think would make a big difference is common deposit insurance. You know, I described how money leaves the countries in trouble, and that creates this divergence. And by the way, one of the reasons why the IMF models, the Troika models have done so badly, they didn't incorporate this kind of dynamic in their models, which they should have done. So that's an example of one of the things that they should have done. Now go back to Germany's view on this. Germany has said they've agreed on the principle of a banking union. A banking union has three parts: common supervision, common resolution if there's a trouble like a problem in a German bank, to reflect on the earlier question, but common deposit insurance. The most important for preventing the divergence is common deposit insurance. Germany's view is that's the last thing we're going to do. We're going to first have common supervision, then we'll have go to common resolution, and then finally deposit insurance. Meanwhile, when money leaves the country, it doesn't go back easily. The recovery, what we call a hysteresis effect, there are asymmetries. When money leaves, when the country starts to recover, it's really hard often to get that money back again.
Just going to pause there. You're next, sir. If we can just get a mic, gentleman in the red T-shirt, you, sir, with the purple tie, and a lady at the back with her hand up. Just keep your hands up if our mics are coming to find you.
Thank you, Professor Stiglitz. I am Robbie Zhang from China's Xinhua News Agency. My colleagues once conducted interviews with you in the United States, and today I'm gonna continue that mission here in London.
Super brief, okay? Just try to keep on.
I noticed that this year you delivered a major speech regarding the G20 in March. And so my questions will be about the G20, which will be taking place in China later this week. My first question is, what would be your proposals and expectations for this year's discussions at the G20 summit in China? And secondly, in your speech this year, you said that China's leadership of G20 comes at a distinctive moment, and it is important that China's leadership should also be extended to the international economic matters. So in what way do you think China's leadership can be extended to the world economic matters and economic governance? Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Okay,
your expectations for the G20, first of all,
yeah.
And how can China's role be extended?
Yeah, so let me try to tie one of the issues that I talked about in the G20 with what we're talking about here. You know, before the 2008 crisis, everybody talked about the problem of global imbalances, which meant that some countries had large surpluses, other countries had large deficits. The basic law of economics is if some country exports more than it imports, some other country is importing more than it exports. This is not a question of theory. This is a question of, you know, economists differ about lots of things. This is one thing that is just true by the numbers. That has one, what they were worried about is if some country has a large surplus, it forces other countries to have a deficit, and there can be a very disorderly unwinding of these imbalances. There's something that's called sudden stops, where money stops going into the countries with a deficit, and that causes instability. Interestingly, China's surpluses back then are smaller than Germany's surpluses today. Germany's surpluses, both as absolutely and as a share of their GDP, are much larger than China's. Now, Germany says they have good surpluses, and China's surpluses are bad surpluses. And, you know, one's based on moral rectitude and the other one is based on currency manipulation. But from a global macroeconomic perspective, whether those arguments are true, The fact of the matter is that surpluses in one country cause deficits in another. So one of the things that I've been arguing is two things. One, there ought to be a global reserve system. And part of the global reserve system could be used to manage these surpluses and deficits. And one part of that is to effectively impose a tax on the surplus countries. So the question was, what are some of the things that could be done to make the system work? The Eurozone ought to have a tax on countries that have a surplus because they impose a cost on the other countries that are therefore wind up with a deficit. I don't expect that to be received by a lot of enthusiasm by the surplus countries. This was an idea that actually Keynes advocated at Bretton Woods, and the United States was not very enthusiastic at the time. Now it has a different view. In terms of global responsibility, I think part of the issues of global responsibility go, in my mind, to issues of it can have a positive contribution. One of the things that countries are facing today, developing countries and emerging markets are facing today, is that when they borrow in, say, New York markets, there's no global bankruptcy law. So if a country can't pay back, if you as an individual can borrow more, and Trump is a real example. Trump has gone bankrupt 4 times. Countries can't go bankrupt, and there's no international rule of law to govern bankruptcy. The UN has adopted a set of principles, but no country has been willing to implement this in terms of legislation. And it would be very good if China could create a global financial market for sovereign debt that would implement the UN principles. That's one thing on one side. On the other side, people from China were shown to be among the largest users of the tax evasion and money laundering in the Panama Papers. And China should take a strong action of transparency, of saying, we want to join the international community in having more transparency, and we will do, Cayman Islands are a big player in China, and we want to join the good citizens that believe that the first element of corporate responsibility is paying your taxes. And something that I've been trying to teach Apple. And that part of responsibility in the international community today in financial markets is a certain minimal level of transparency, which I'm afraid is not universally shared.
We're down to our last 5 minutes. I'm just trying to get in as many hands as we can. Sir, do you have the mic? You were next. Whilst we're waiting for the mic to get over to you, you go, sir. Yep.
Thank you. Professor Stiglitz, I think you might have just touched on my question, actually. We read in the media this week about the EU trying to play hardball with Apple about the tax issues with respect to Ireland. Apple are outraged, and of course Ireland nonplussed. But I wonder if this is perhaps the beginning of some way of redressing some of the inequalities that you speak about, number one. And number two, what impact do you think this might have positively or even negatively on the European situation in the Eurozone?
Yeah, I think the European Commission ruling was absolutely right. I think what Ireland did was absolutely wrong. They were engaged in facilitating tax avoidance, tax evasion, whatever you call it. Apple knew it. They were using the same ingenuity that they used to make those wonderful iPhones and the curves on the phone, all that brilliant work. They were using that same ingenuity to avoid paying their share of taxes. And they avoided taxes in the United States, they avoided taxes in Europe. And all that the European Commission did was to catch them at this game. They were claiming that all the revenues that all the profits they were getting in Europe originated from a few people in Ireland. And then they said, actually, we'll attribute all the profits to the headquarters that exist in cyberspace, and no one has to pay taxes on that. So it was a massive, I think the right word is fraud, but tax avoidance is the best face you can put on it. And they're not the only firm. Different firms have engaged on this. I've been part of an international commission that has been trying to figure out how to stop this massive tax avoidance by these corporations, which, and you're absolutely right, this money deprives countries of what they need for growth, for addressing the problem of inequality. I just got an email from somebody pointing out that this money alone what it would have done for the Irish education system. You know, this is a big deal for Ireland. And, but when you add it up over all the companies, we're talking about tens of billions of dollars every year that are not being paid.
We're going to take the last question, sir. Thank you.
Professor Stiglitz, I'm going to try to put you on the spot here. As you know, financial crises happen on a 6 to 10 year cycle, and it's been about 8-9 years since the last crisis in 2007, 2008. Since then, we know we've got a debt issue in China, near enough stagnation and economic stagnation and deflation in Europe, and strong or strengthening growth in the United States, but growth that is still below the average for the United States. Are we sleepwalking into another crisis? And if so, where do you think, or what do you think the cause of that crisis is going to be?
Well, I think the most likely cause of a major economic crisis is the euro. But I'm not forecasting, as the first question was, I'm not forecasting that it's going to be as you walk out of the doctor's office. It could be any time. It could be this year, it could be in 5 years.
Do you believe in those cycles that the speaker was talking about?
No, I don't believe that. I think that there's no regularity to these cycles. What I think is true is that we're in for a period of weak economic growth unless there are some major reforms in economic programs. I think, to answer one of the questions, if Hillary gets elected and there's enough of a Republican Congress, there will be enough stimulus to the U.S. economy that we can become an engine of economic growth. I think if some of the reforms that I describe in my book were done for the Eurozone could start to grow. But if they're not done, the Eurozone will continue to be a drag on global economic growth. So what we're really seeing here is more of what you might call a Japanese-style malaise that could go on for a very long time.
Stagnation. We will end it on that note. You heard Joseph say,
note.
but on that optimistic high, don't believe a word he says about university professors not working hard. I've seen how fast he signs books. The real work begins outside in the hall, where I think you're going to be sticking around for a few moments to sign some copies. But thank you very much for joining us, ladies and gentlemen, and our enormous thanks to you, sir.